The Sir Roland Wilson Foundation, I think, is one of the more remarkable initiatives this university has been party to in recent years. It's made possible by a generous gift to the university from the Wilson family that was matched by the university. And the purpose of the gift, the purpose of the foundation, is to promote significant dialogue and research interest in public policy. To date, this has been achieved through the annual oration for which we're gathered here tonight, but there's some other new things in the pipeline that I'll mention in just a moment. Before I get there, let me also acknowledge, in the spirit of honest advertising, other entities that have been key in making tonight's event possible. The Economic Society of Australia, the Centre for Economic History at the Research School of Economics here in ANU's College of Business and Economics, and the Crawford School of Public Policy here in ANU's College of Asia and Pacific. And a quick shout out on the way on behalf of Tim Hatton, who's been one of the key architects in making Barry's visit possible. There's a workshop happening this Friday in Tim's Centre for Economic History. It's running most of the day from 11 till 5. And if you want to hear more Barry's the last speaker. So if you arrived at around about 3:30, you'd miss out on Tim and some other interesting people, but you'd catch Barry. And if you're interested, that's in the Arndt Building in the College of Business and Economics at the north end of campus. I said the Sir Roland Wilson Foundation, and I should mention there's some other board members here tonight, has got an extraordinary new frontier for the work of the foundation. And that's something that we launched in 2011, which is a partnership with the Commonwealth, under which PhD scholarships are awarded to senior Commonwealth public servants to pursue topics of national and enduring interest in public policy. The first 5 of these scholars began their full-time study here at ANU in February last year. The scheme is endowed in perpetuity, and we welcomed 4 new students. For several years they're no longer senior officials, for several years they're students, into the program early this year. I sit on the selection committee for that. The competition for it, the quality of the applications is extraordinary. It is a really remarkable initiative of the university and the Commonwealth coming together. Not everyone in this room is as young as our former Vice-Chancellor, Dean Terrell. If you were, you'd have a personal memory of Sir Roland Wilson. For those of you who aren't quite of the age of Dean, let me just give you a little bit of background. In 1932, Roland Wilson was the first economist to be appointed to a senior position in the Commonwealth Public Service. At the time of his appointment, one newspaper noted perceptively, hang on, I've missed a point. He went on to be appointed as head of the Treasury in 1951 at the age of 47, and he held that position until he resigned from the public service in 1966, making him the longest serving head of the Treasury. At the time of his appointment to the position of Secretary of the Treasury, a newspaper noted, for 50 years, Treasury administration has been in the hands of persons who were predominantly accountants and graduates from Treasury's own accounting departments. Wilson's appointment marks the first Australian experiment of this kind, and it is a good bet that as far ahead as one can see, all of his successors will be economists too. Wilson held not one doctorate, but 2 doctorates, one from Oxford, the other from Chicago, where he studied under Jacob Viner. One of his theses was on capital movements and their economic consequences. In 1945, Wilson was Australia's representative at the Conference of San Francisco that established the United Nations. It's widely acknowledged that Wilson was largely responsible for having the full employment pledge inserted in the United Nations Charter. Sir Roland Wilson's greatest work in Treasury was in fostering a more efficient and dynamic economy. He was opposed to Australia's high rates of trade protection, often putting him at odds with his colleagues. Wilson was primarily interested in accelerating Australia's economic development. If he were alive today, I have absolutely no doubt he would be in the audience and just delighted to see who we have as our speaker this evening, Barry Eichengreen. Segue to Barry Eichengreen. Barry's a pretty extraordinary person too. He holds the sort of position that's very rare in this country. I can think of only one example, but maybe others can think of more. He's the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at UC Berkeley. That combination's not so rare in the United States. It is rare in this country, and we're the poorer for it. He's been teaching at Berkeley since 1987. He's a research associate at the NBER. He's a research fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research in London. 97-98, he was senior policy advisor at the IMF. Lots of other things you could say about Barry. He's the convener of the Bellagio group of academics and economic officials, and chair of the Academic Advisory Committee for the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington, D.C. Those of you who know him know it's a CV as long as your arm. Let me just mention a couple of book titles. From Miracle to Maturity, The Growth of the Korean Economy. That's with Dwight Perkins and Kwan Ho Shin. The World Economy After the Global Financial Crisis, co-edited with Bok Yong Park. And Exorbitant Privilege, The Rise and Fall of the Dollar and the Future of the International Monetary System, which was shortlisted for the Financial Times and Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year. So those 3 books are his books since 2011.
So shortlisted means did not win.
And there's a whole lot more. And that's before we go to the papers and all the rest of it. You get the picture. Let's forget the official script on Barry. Most of you will have a sense of it. I mean, what I think really stands out about Barry is he's the kind of economist everyone wants to say they're a friend of. To my eye, he lies at the sort of the interstices of 2 of the most remarkable and now incredibly precious sub-branches of economics, economic history and international economics. And what I associate with Barry more than anything else, his judiciousness. There's just a deep, quiet wisdom about him. And he's got an ability to draw examples from just about anywhere in the world and relate his analysis, his story, to just about anywhere in the world. Time for you, Barry.
So Maestro, the microphones are all working. It's a pleasure to be introduced by Andrew McIntyre, who's an old friend from UCSD, meaning University of California at San Diego. It's a pleasure to be back at ANU. I spent 2 months here a while ago, before many people in the room were born. And it's a pleasure to be sponsored by the Sir Roland Wilson Foundation. As I learned about Roland Wilson, I learned about his desire to try to combine scholarship and public service, and the story of how he was offered a chair at ANU and in his wisdom chose to remain in the public sector. So I find that quite inspiring. I do think scholarship is at its best when scholars think about the public policy applications of economic scholars, think about the public policy applications of their work, and similarly civil servants who are aware of what is going on in the academy are best able to advance their agendas as well. So I try to do that in my modest way by taking a historical approach to understanding both analytical problems and public policy problems. There are many other ways, obviously, of doing that as well. I spoke, to elaborate the theme a little bit more, I spoke yesterday morning at Treasury. That talk was more wide-ranging, but I was struck by the fact I thought people would ask me, given the part of the world that we're in, about China and about renminbi internationalization and about some of the other topics on which I work. But to the contrary, all of the questions were about, I exaggerate only slightly, all of the questions were about the euro and the euro crisis. This is very much on people's minds because it is a very real issue for the world economy and not least for Australia. So it is the gift that never stops giving. It's the crisis that doesn't go away. It's a crisis characterized by a good deal of unproductive discussion. There is a lot of finger pointing involved, who is to blame for the crisis. There is a lot of moralizing, thrifty Northern Europeans pointing their fingers at spendthrift Southern Europeans. There are assertions that what we are witnessing is the death throes of the European welfare state. Many people draw the conclusion prematurely, in my view, that we are seeing that the European Union and or the euro are effectively doomed. So I will argue for the next half hour or so that none of these frames for the crisis is especially informative. I will try to do so in part by taking a longer view of the origins and development of the crisis, embedding that in at least a brief discussion of the development of the European economy, the EU and the Eurozone over the second half of the 20th century. And I think my conclusions will be somewhat out of consensus. So I'm neither as optimistic as some, nor as pessimistic as others, and yet I assert that my conclusions in that messy middle are somewhat out of consensus in terms of what I see happening next. I will start with the observation that European integration is a very long-standing idea, as epitomized by these three characters on the right. William Penn, who proposed a European Parliament, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who proposed a European Federation, Jeremy Bentham, who proposed a European Assembly. After World War II, the idea of European integration was absolutely fundamental to the development of political thought, except of course in the UK, that small windswept island off the northwest coast of Europe, which always has one foot in and 1 foot outside. But I think the long-standing nature of the idea is a first indication that the EU, despite all its problems, is a deeply embedded, long-standing idea, long-standing construct that will not be easy to unwind. The same can be said of the euro. The founding document of the European Union back in 1957 characterized exchange rates as a matter of common concern. Monetary and exchange rate policy of the individual countries was a matter of concern to the group. Pierre Werner, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, the gentleman at the top of this slide, who chaired the committee that reported on monetary integration, recommended in 1970 that Europe complete the transition to a single currency within 10 years. Helmut Schmidt and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, depicted in the middle, moved significantly in that direction in 1979, creating the European monetary system. Jacques Delors, the French technocrat at the bottom, French technocrats figure prominently in this story, was responsible for another such report in 1989, leading to the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992 that committed Europe to completing this transition. So again, there's a long history of thought and action pointing in the direction of monetary integration, again suggesting to me that the euro, despite all its problems, will, like the European Union, not be easy to unwind. So this is not the first crisis that Europe and the European Union have faced in their post-World War II history. Jean Monnet, another founding French technocrat of today's European Union, had a statement to the effect Europe is forged in crisis, and the Europe that we see today is the sum of its response to those crises. Europe has repeatedly been confronted with the challenge of whether to go forward toward deeper integration or to go back. It's repeatedly been faced with the reality that the halfway house that it currently occupies will not be viable indefinitely, and whenever it's been faced with the decision of whether to go forward or to go back, it has gone forward toward deeper integration. So where we will find out yet again in the not too distant future whether Monnet's point still stands. How did Europe get to where it is today? One could imagine a very long historical lecture attempting to answer that question. If you allow me to greatly abbreviate the answer and the lecture, I would say the story starts with the golden age of economic growth. After World War II, the third quarter of the 20th century, a period when the European economy grew very considerably faster than the lead economy of the period, the United States. The third quarter of the 20th century was when Europe closed much of the output and productivity gap vis-a-vis the United States. And then something began to go wrong. So already before, well before the advent of the euro in 1999, the convergence upward of European incomes toward the levels of income and productivity in the lead country, the United States, that process of convergence had stopped and it went into reverse. So what I show you here, the red line, is one controversial measure of that process. Incomes adjusted for changes in prices across countries. In the euro area, relative incomes per member of the working age population relative to those in the United States. And you can see this rapid process of convergence from the early 1960s until sometime in the early 1980s when it goes into reverse. One reason this measure is controversial is that income per member of the working age population is not obviously the correct measure. Among other things, we know that Europeans work fewer hours per year than Americans. So if Americans work on average 1,800 hours a year, Europeans residents of the Eurozone work on average only 1,400 hours a year. So part of what we see could be that Europeans enjoying higher incomes choose in their wisdom to take more of those higher living standards and higher levels of productivity in the form of additional leisure. But even if you make that adjustment as here and you compare GDP per hour worked rather than GDP or income per working age member of the population, you see the same thing. The stagnation and the end of convergence, indeed its reversal, is still evident, although it becomes evident later, perhaps in the late 1990s. So this is not a phenomenon whose roots economists adequately understand. If you go to the literature and ask why did the convergence of Europe toward the economic frontier stop and go into reverse, people will point to the heavy regulation of the European economy. They will suggest that perhaps Europe has been slower than the United States in adopting and commercializing IT. They may point to labor market reforms that brought less skilled workers back into employment, which, whatever the other benefits of those reforms, reduced the average productivity of workers. None of these explanations is especially convincing. Overregulation perhaps, but there's been quite dramatic deregulation in Europe in the last decade and a half. Slow adoption of information technologies, yes, but that was true during the period when Europe was doing well as during the subsequent period. Labor market reforms that brought less skilled workers back into employment, yes, but if you try to quantify that effect, it is relatively small. So these hypotheses take us only part way toward the answer. It's uncomfortable for economists. We are not modest by temperament to acknowledge that the reasons for Europe's lag, starting perhaps in the 1990s, is something of a mystery. The point, however, is that Europe's problems had begun to develop well before the onset of the recent crisis. Although one can argue, and I am now about to argue, that the euro was a confounding factor. Those problems may have been evident even before the advent of the euro. The advent of the euro didn't help, to the contrary. So, and a final point about this would be that at the same time this economic convergence between the US and Europe stopped, convergence within Europe stopped. In the earlier period, much as was true across the Atlantic, within Europe, the lower income, lower productivity, less developed economies were catching up to the wealthier ones. So the top panel of this figure, I apologize for the small size, shows you initial per capita GDP on the horizontal axis and the growth rate on the vertical. So the top panel is telling you from the 1960s through the 1980s, the countries that started out behind on the left had the relatively rapid growth rates. That's what the downward sloping line is telling you. That relationship goes away in the 1990s, and disturbingly it reverses subsequently with the advent of the euro. So what was going on? One of the even more peculiar things that was going on was that at the same time the real sector, economic rates of growth were diverging, conditions in financial markets were converging, and in particular the interest rates that governments had to pay on their debts in the formerly problem countries of Southern Europe were converging down to German levels. So the figure on the right here shows you interest rates on 10-year government bonds relative to those on German bonds, the high quality, low interest rate benchmark. You can see first the convergence downward to German levels and then the crisis on the right-hand side as yields paid by other countries explode upward. And I think this peculiar process of nominal convergence, whose explanation is not entirely clear, helps us understand how major imbalances between Europe's core and Europe's periphery then developed. So the most important effect of monetary union in my story was to lower borrowing costs in Southern Europe. In other words, giving Greece real money brought Greek interest rates, shown in orange, down to German levels, shown in yellow. And you can see how this process was well underway even before the euro was actually created in 1999. Those lower borrowing costs then encouraged a big party. So countries in Southern Europe began to spend much more than they saved. The current account of the balance of payments moved into deficit. Something different was going on in Germany. In other words, someone else was saving more than they were investing and loaning those spendthrift Southern Europeans all that money. It wasn't only or even mainly government borrowing that was occurring here. It was a private sector spending boom. So this figure shows you what was happening to the development of consumption spending in real terms over the period after 1999. It's flat in Germany. German consumption wasn't rising, but it was rising in Portugal, it was rising in Spain, it was rising in Greece, it was rising in Ireland. Firms enjoying this strong demand for non-traded goods on their local markets were able to pass through that higher demand to their workers. So more spending translated into higher costs of production and deteriorating competitiveness. So I show you here the development of the cost of producing a unit of output, unit labor costs. In Germany, it's flat. In Portugal, it goes up a bit. In Greece, it goes up quite a bit. In Spain, it goes up quite a bit. Ireland is a peculiar case in many respects. Ireland doesn't fit the story. German labor costs are going down, other labor costs are going up. That's the essence of the story, and that translates into changes in export market share, down in Portugal, down in Greece, down in Spain, up in Germany. Ireland is a complication for the story. The bottom line being that it's not all Southern Europe. Northern Europe was complicit in these developments as well. It takes two to tango. It's not helpful to view the crisis as a morality play. A more accurate narrative, in my view, would go like this. The false belief that monetary union eliminated credit risk, it eliminated the risk of default on external borrowing, guaranteed fast growth in the euro area periphery. That in turn encouraged reckless lending by French and German banks. It encouraged reckless borrowing by Spanish and Portuguese banks. The result was over-leveraged banks at the center and a loss of competitiveness at the periphery. And then Europe was sideswiped by a financial crisis originating in the United States, which widened debt burdens, damaged growth, and left no time to complete the process of fiscal and political integration. All of a sudden, the markets awoke in 2010 after a long slumber. They realized all was not well. Maybe, just maybe, they concluded European governments would have trouble repaying what they'd borrowed, and Southern European countries had to pay exorbitant prices to borrow if they now could borrow at all. So the implication of that is that Europe now has a crisis. I think it's useful to, it's critical to unpack that statement and to acknowledge that Europe has not one crisis, but three. It has a debt crisis, it has a banking crisis, and it has a growth crisis. So in the remainder of my talk, I want to say a few words of about the nature of each of those and how they might be addressed, and then we can open it up. As for the debt crisis, it's important to observe that debt levels, while high, are basically the same as the United States. So government debt in euro area countries, which averages on the order of 85%, is only very slightly higher than the federal debt to GDP ratio in the United States. The problem being that that debt is very unevenly distributed across the member states, with countries like Greece and Ireland, Italy, Spain, Portugal having disproportionate and arguably unsustainable debt loads. It's important to emphasize that while Greece is a special case, in the case of the others, these debt problems are largely a result of the crisis rather than independent causes. The now crisis countries didn't enter 2008, 2009 with unsustainable debts. Those debts have been rendered borderline or outright unsustainable by the recessions that have followed, whether self-inflicted or not, and by the banking crises and the policies that have socialized the losses incurred by the banks. So this is a big problem, obviously, and it's the aspect of the crisis that receives the most attention in the financial press, certainly. You don't have to be an economist to understand that in order to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, they're either going to have to shrink the numerator or grow the denominator. You can shrink the numerator of the debt to GDP ratio by running surpluses year after year after year for, in effect, several generations. Or you can shrink the numerator by restructuring debts in the manner of Greece, or ideally in a more efficient and equitable way than it was in the case of Greece. Easier, in principle, is to grow the denominator, to raise nominal GDP, which you can do hypothetically with economic growth, or I begin to suspect equally hypothetically by having the central bank raise its inflation target. You can raise nominal GDP rather than real, but some combination of the four aforementioned policies will have to be pursued. In many ways, the banking crisis is the more serious crisis now afflicting the Eurozone. The European economy is much more bank-based and bank-centered than the US economy, for example. The European economy relies much more heavily on bank credit and bank intermediation. And in turn, European banks are more highly leveraged even than US banks. They rely even more on Fiscal wholesale funding. In other words, banks borrow from other banks, European banks borrow from US banks, which is what got them into such trouble when Lehman Brothers failed and dollar credit grew scarce. They borrow from hedge funds and the like. So you can see European bank leverage, very simply measured in blue compared to the leverage of US banks at the top. You can see reliance on wholesale funding, which has fallen quite considerably, all to the good, in my view, in the United States, in the bottom panel, in green, compared to Europe, where it has still hardly moved at all. So the banking problem in Europe continues to fester. We did not exactly resolve our banking crisis in the United States in admirable fashion. There are a lot of things to criticize, but we fixed the banks much more quickly than the Europeans have. There has been a reluctance to fess up to the problem. There's the difficulty of who moves first in the European context, because there does not exist a single bank regulator, or much less a banking union. There are recent examples of the very grave economic and financial difficulties that can flow from a reluctance to address this problem. Everybody can say Cyprus, and soon everybody will be able to say Slovenia, which is the next one in the pipeline. So this makes the economic situation in Europe all the worse. European banks are over-leveraged and undercapitalized. They are reluctant to assume additional commitments. They're not lending. That in turn makes the growth crisis even worse. And the fact that the economy isn't growing, non-performing loans proliferate, makes the banking problem even worse. We thought there was an acknowledgement of this aspect of the crisis last summer, when in yet the latest of a series of European summits on June 29th, 2012, who can think back that far, there was an agreement to address this problem and create a banking union with a single supervisor of European banks, with a single uniform deposit insurance scheme, and with a Eurozone level fund to back up that deposit insurance scheme and deal with the problems of bad banks. And there's been nothing but backtracking on the banking union commitment ever since. So what Europe has on its hands as a result is, certainly Southern Europe, is a crisis really of Great Depression dimensions. So look at the green line for Greece here. Greek GDP has fallen now on the order of 20%. It will almost certainly fall by 25 to 30% before the crisis is over. The same will be the case in Cyprus, and if these problems are not addressed, the same conceivably could be the case in other European countries. Why is not hard to see. Fiscal policy remains strongly contractionary in Europe. So I'm show you here a measure of the discretionary element of fiscal policy. By how much are they raising taxes and cutting government spending in 2011 in blue, in 2012 in green, in 2013 in black, Eurozone-wide by a very considerable amount, and in some crisis countries like Spain by even more. Monetary policy doesn't make that process any easier. We know that the only circumstances when fiscal contraction of that sort doesn't cause a Great Depression is when there's some other source of demand. For example, when monetary policy is supportive of spending and economic growth, and that has not been the case in Europe. Last week's 25 basis point reduction in the ECB's policy rate notwithstanding. European leaders assure us that recovery is right around the corner. I don't see it. I don't see it in the data. I don't see it in consumer confidence. I don't see it in the behavior of firms. If recovery was right around the corner, European companies would be starting now to build inventories that they could sell into the market when that recovery sets in, and there's no sign of that yet. There is some rebalancing in Europe. You know, if there was this problem in the past, the big fiesta problem, where Southern Europeans spent too much, now if Southern Europeans are going to spend less, someone else, Northern Europeans, have to spend more. It's comforting, at least to an extent, that wage settlements in Germany are up by 3% in the last 6 months. Pay packets are growing fatter, so there's at least the potential for Northern Europeans to spend more, but there's no sign of that in German consumption behavior, and no effort on the part of the German government to jumpstart the process. So rebalancing on the demand side potentially, but not no evidence of it occurring yet. On the supply side, there has been some adjustment in relative costs of production. So here's one of those figures for unit labor costs. How much does it cost to produce 1 unit of output? You can see here the development of the problem. Again, unit labor costs going up across Southern Europe, but not in Germany at the bottom. And then you can see considerable sign of adjustment after 2009. So the positive spin on this figure would be dotted red line. The Irish never thought that they were the richest people in Europe, so they have accepted reductions in money wages, and their unit labor costs have come down quite considerably since 2009. It's important to give the Greeks credit. They get a lot of criticism, but look at how their unit labor costs have come down. The slightly less positive spin on this is that some of the productivity improvement has undoubtedly come in the form of laying off the least productive workers. So it's not clear that if and when the situation normalizes, this adjustment in competitiveness will be sustained. And what you see in relative costs of production, you also see in relative export performance, that the Southern Europeans are doing better. So, but the problem is that the only thing that is keeping Southern Europe alive is that export performance, that Eurozone countries are exporting more. So this figure shows you what's happened between 2008 and basically now. In blue for the Eurozone, and as a metric in red for the United States. And the positive development, the thing that has grown, is exports in blue, the EXP, and actually government spending. That government spending went up and now it's going back down. But the other elements of spending that you would need to see for a sustainable recovery, be that consumption, be that investment, are not responding. So what does Europe need to do? It's really, really very simple if you buy my diagnosis. It needs to, it has a debt crisis. It needs to solve its debt crisis through a combination of nominal income growth, which can be achieved 2 ways, and debt restructuring, which I think is unavoidable, and which we've learned from the case of Greece is entirely feasible under present institutional arrangements. It needs to solve its banking crisis by injecting capital into its banks, creating a single supervisor, a single deposit insurance scheme, a single resolution mechanism, and a single deposit insurance fund. Finally, it needs to solve its growth crisis through more supportive monetary and fiscal policies, and by continuing to follow through on structural reforms. So I think one can imagine there the elements of a grand bargain where Southern European countries make unmistakably clear that they are committed to structural reform, to making their economies more competitive, so that they can back away from the bailout trough in the longer term. And Northern European governments, confident that the Southern Europeans will not have to come back for yet another bailout, will not be playing the current game with them anymore. The current game being, we're not going to help you with fiscal stimulus. We, the European Central Bank, are not going to help you with a more supportive policy, because if we take the pressure off, you're not going to follow through with reform. If there is a credible commitment to reform in Southern Europe, in principle, there could be an adjustment in the direction of more pro-growth policies in Northern Europe. I can imagine such a bargain. Whether the Europeans can imagine it is another question. And in the longer run, there's a rich agenda to discuss and follow through on. There's the prospect, the possibility of fiscal union, where a federal system of taxes and transfers like we have in the United States, like you have in Australia, ideally better than the ones we have in the United States and you have in Australia, could be put in place. In Europe. Movement in the direction of political union, so there was a more powerful European Parliament to demand accountability of those officials responsible for the operation of the fiscal union and the banking union. Angela Merkel famously said a while ago, there will be no quantum leap in European integration, and this is at least one respect in which I agree entirely with Mrs. Merkel, that this is what I describe here is a long-run agenda that will take a lot of time to hammer out. It needs to be pursued, but it will only be feasible if Europe in the meanwhile addresses its immediate problems and the short-run agenda. How far does Europe have to go in the direction of fiscal integration? I don't think it needs to go all the way toward pooling the tax revenues of the member states in Brussels, which won't happen anyway. But three critical fiscal functions need to be federalized. The Deposit Insurance and Bank Resolution Fund that I described before, a fiscal facility to deal with emergencies. The statute and mandate of the European Central Bank doesn't really permit it to act as a normal central bank, as a lender of last resort. So Europe has created something called the European Stability Mechanism to act as that lender of last resort. It needs to fund it adequately. And finally, it has a full-fledged social and political and developmental crisis in Greece and Cyprus, and it needs to create a Marshall Fund for those economies. Will Europe do all this? This is a very difficult and demanding agenda. There will have to be compromises all around. I see two reasons to think positive, which I try to do in this context. The first reason to think that Europe will move forward and do what it takes is that it has so much invested in its integration project. The euro is the symbolic capstone of that project. Jean Monnet reminds us that every time Europe has been confronted with the choice of going back or going forward, it goes forward because of the symbolic and substantive importance of the European Union, of which the euro, like it or not, I would argue, has become an integral part. And the second reason is that while holding the euro together will be enormously expensive and difficult politically, attempting to dismantle it will be even more expensive and difficult politically. I think trying to dismantle it would precipitate the mother of all financial crises. The first minute anyone cottoned on to the possibility that the Greek Parliament was whispering about the possibility of reintroducing the drachma, every individual with a single euro in a Greek bank would wire all his or her money to Frankfurt. Everyone who was holding a Greek bond would attempt to sell it to someone else, and you know what happens when that hot potato problem develops in financial markets. So such a country, call it Greece, would have to close down, call it Cyprus for ease of exposition, would have to close down its banking system, close down its financial markets, seal its economy to the outside world for a significant period. So this would make the 2008 financial crisis look like small potatoes. So that was my argument in a paper I wrote for this book in 2007, about why there was no possibility that a country would ever leave the euro. So that argument was impeccable on economic grounds, but Andrew's introduction notwithstanding, there is a political problem with it, that we can sit here and talk about the economic costs and benefits of alternative courses of action, but there's no guarantee that in the heat of battle, politicians will opt for the lower cost alternative. Bad economic things can still happen for political reasons. But there's a second objection to the argument. We now have the case of a country in Europe that has already closed down its entire banking and financial system and effectively sealed itself off from the rest of Europe. And that country is Cyprus. So that points up the question in quite vivid terms. This problem occurred in late March, and where are we now? Here we are in early May, and Cyprus is still in the euro. No steps have been taken to prepare or seriously discuss reintroducing the national currency. Why hasn't Cyprus taken the opportunity to exit the eurozone? I think the forces holding the eurozone together are quite powerful, and compared to the historical precedent about how countries left the gold standard in the 1930s, leaving the euro is more difficult. It's more difficult technically because devaluing your own currency against gold is easier than reintroducing a national currency that you no longer have. Financial cooperation within Europe is more extensive even now than it was in Europe in the early 1930s when the gold standard fell apart. So Cyprus is still getting low interest loans in the amount of 10 billion euros from its EU partners, loans that would be cut off in a minute if they abandoned the euro. And there is still the larger political project to defend. That's of shared value in Europe, and it's certainly a value to the citizens of Cyprus who reside on an island whose northern half is occupied by the Turkish army. So I think in the case of Cyprus, but more generally, the forces that work to hold the eurozone together remain quite powerful. At the same time, I must acknowledge that this entire argument predicated on the idea that when faced with a Monet-style crisis, Europe moves forward rather than moves back. That's based on the idea that there is such a thing as European solidarity, and that solidarity has hardly been evident in the management of the Cypriot crisis or in the management of the crises that preceded it. I think it is not unfair to say that Cyprus was another instance of Europe's big countries and a specific big country in particular imposing its will on Europe's small countries, giving them essentially a take it or leave it offer something that is creating a backlash in the small countries against the big ones, something that's creating a backlash in the small countries across Southern Europe against the European project. So that is a fundamental political problem that will have to be acknowledged and addressed, and hopefully it will be acknowledged and addressed quickly after the German elections are out of the way in September of this year. So that's not the most hopeful possible note on which to end, but hoping against hope, I remain positive about how this is going to turn out. I thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take questions.
I'd like to hear your comments and your views on countries that don't have a euro, or specifically Britain, say a country like Poland, for example. How does it fit into your analysis? Do you see the cost of adopting the euro as far exceed any benefits?
So I don't know if everyone, including the audience on the web, could hear. So the question is about EU member states that have not adopted the euro. What stance should they take? Until recently, I think I would have said wait and see. This is not a smoothly operating monetary union. Why would you want to be part of it if you could wait? I'm increasingly inclined toward a stronger statement at this point, that with benefit of hindsight, now we can see that the creation of the euro was a mistake. So maybe those with an opt-out, the UK has an opt-out, will want to retain that privilege permanently. But I think more generally, what we've learned is that you can't have monetary union without banking union, fiscal union, and political union. And the countries with the option of staying outside should wait and see that the commitment to adding those additional three elements and progress on adding those three elements is there.
Colleagues, are people willing to agree to a short question, short response?
Short answers.
I've got at least four in the queue already. Ross, Hal, somebody here, and then over here. Straight up the back.
Thank you. Ross McLeod from AU. I don't think I share your extreme pessimism about what would happen if Greece, for example, opted to leave the euro and reinstate the drachma. Presumably, nobody in their right mind, if that's what's been talked about, nobody in their right mind would assume that the drachma would have the same exchange rate as it did back in the year 1999. Presumably, you would have to introduce the drachma gradually and possibly not even specify an exchange rate, let the market determine what that exchange rate would be. If you did it like that, I don't really see why there should be all this immediate outflow. I mean, if you threaten people with cutting the value of their investments by a huge amount, of course there would be outflow. But if you don't specify the exchange rate but allow the market to figure that out, why could there not be a fairly peaceful financial transition?
So a short answer would be the whole purpose of reintroducing the drachma would be to jumpstart growth, bring down unemployment, make Greek exports more competitive. In other words, push down the local currency relative to the euro. Everybody would know that's the intent, and it would happen on the first minute. The second answer would be there is no such thing as the gradual reintroduction of a national currency. As soon as people saw it coming, they would flee into foreign currency. And I think, you know, there are various schemes out there about that are classified under the rubric of a parallel currency, that the euro could continue to circulate in Greece, and in parallel with that, the government could reintroduce the drachma. But who would accept drachmas under those circumstances? It doesn't seem to me gradual is possible.
Thanks very much, Barry, for a very illuminating talk. You said very little about exchange rates. That's what really struck me, apart from all the illuminating remarks. And if you think about the crisis currently in some of the southern European countries, it's not that different from that which occurred in the Asian financial crisis. You know, orders of magnitude a bit more, but not a lot. And as we know, the Southeast Asian economies recovered very fast from the Asian financial crisis for two reasons. One was they had these really drastic exchange rate depreciation, which boosted their competitiveness, and of course the global economy was growing quite strongly. So the essence of your story is that Europe's fighting with one key policy lever absent, and doesn't that mean other things have to be working a lot harder to get that, to get the changes, in particular labour markets and microeconomic reform? Trying to think through history, how many cases have there been of quick recoveries without an exchange rate adjustment, once we had flexible exchange rates?
Yeah, so the point is very well taken in all respects. Members of the Eurozone not possessing an exchange rate vis-a-vis their partners, external devaluation is not possible vis-a-vis their partners, so internal devaluation, this excruciating, grinding internal deflation is all that's available to them. What does that bode for the future? It does not bode an Asian-style V-shaped recovery. It bodes a very extended U-shaped recession. So I don't think miraculous recovery is in the cards. And as I tried to argue in the talk and in response to the previous question, with benefit of hindsight, tying that one hand behind these countries' backs may have been a mistake. But I think because of the nature of the European Union, monetary union well may be irreversible. It's a mistake with which they will have to live.
Thanks very much for your talk. To my mind, a large part of the cause for the euro crisis came from, as was mentioned, abandoning control over nominal exchange rates, which means there's real exchange rates can only adjust slowly through price changes. And in Europe, you've got a heterogeneous set of countries that are that suffer different shocks, different times, and so we see what we saw: real exchange rates get out of whack, countries lose competitiveness. A lot of the kind of solutions proposed to this go in the direction of greater uniformity of policy across the Eurozone, removing discretion from individual countries to make policy. While there are some benefits, say in common bank resolution provisions, isn't it the case that with these heterogeneous economies, with different shocks, without an exchange rate between them, without a single labour market, there are always going to be crises like this, even if we can attenuate their magnitude, they'll keep coming back?
So very, very briefly, I think it's important to distinguish the causes of the crisis from feasible and appropriate responses to the crisis. So I would not agree that the absence of an exchange rate was a cause of the crisis. This massive capital flow, recklessly unmanaged from Northern to Southern Europe, was the cause of the crisis. The fact that macroeconomic policy, macro-prudential policy to restrain excessive lending and excessive borrowing, and to restrain the pass-through of that excessive borrowing to real estate markets and real wages and the like, that was the fundamental cause of the crisis that led the vulnerabilities to build up, and then the balloon was popped by subprime in the U.S. And all that. I certainly agree that when you have a crisis of this magnitude, not having an exchange rate as an instrument of adjustment makes dealing with it all that much worse. But if we're talking about how to prevent this kind of thing from happening again, I think the key is banking union and preventing those bank intermediated problems from developing in the same way again in the future. And then in terms of dealing with the current problem, it accurately diagnosing what caused the crisis. It wasn't fiscal policy, first and foremost, leads you to prescribing a different medicine at this point in time. One-size-fits-all fiscal policy may not be the appropriate way of dealing with the crisis now.
Colleagues, I'm afraid this is going to have to be the last question.
George Mino, Foreign Affairs and Trade Department. Professor Eichengreen, your speech, you left us with a sense that you were an optimist at the end, but as the questions have unfolded, I hear more and more pessimism, and maybe this will just add a little bit further of a note of that. The debt crisis response, the growth crisis response are somewhat contradictory, obviously, as we try and unwind the debt crisis with fiscal rectitude, we do what we don't want to do to the growth story, and that's the question. How long is this flat U-shaped curve? Do you worry about countries like France who, as you showed with your own slides, the unit labour costs are going up, where the reform story is not a happy outlook? Just how pessimistic are you?
Well, I'm very worried, as many people are, I think, about the possibility of a lost decade in Europe. The more optimistic answer would be they're already halfway through it. But what is remarkable to me, and I'm not sure whether it's a positive or not, is the striking tolerance of the European public and the European polity for the suffering they're experiencing. 27% unemployment rates in Spain and Greece, 50% youth unemployment rates across Southern Europe. This is a full-fledged social crisis. And yet the anti-Europe parties and the parties that you would, the political groups that you would expect to say enough is enough and damn the consequences. We're not going to continue with Plan A, continue to receive strikingly limited support. So I think one explanation for that is that compared to the collapse of the gold standard, my base case, the development of social safety nets and the like has provided enough protection to publics that the European political system can absorb, for better or for worse, a lost decade. And the other part of the explanation is that this larger European project is, in fact, something that voting publics attach high value to. So I don't know if that's a more optimistic or a more pessimistic answer to your question. My probability distribution attaches a very low weight still to euro collapse, a very low weight to miraculous resumption of growth, but a high likelihood to extended period of stagnation.